Artist Federico Uribe, Dr. Rowan H. McLachlan, a coral expert at Oregon State University, and Laurel Zaima, Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory environmental educator, are going to be discussing the life cycles of oceans, their life-giving properties, how they're being transformed by pollution and climate change, and what we can do to protect them. This program is inspired by Federico Uribe, Plastic Reef, and the exhibition Cycles of Nature. Federico Uribe's artwork reproduces marine ecosystems with used plastic tools, items that are readily found floating in the oceans and polluting our waters. Daily plastic objects, including bottles, bottle caps, plastic cutlery, flip-flops, among other items, are woven in curious and unpredictable, repetitive, and almost compulsive ways. The artwork invites the viewer to reflect on the indiscriminate use of plastic and the disastrous impact of plastic pollution on marine ecosystems worldwide. I want to thank Art Bridges for their generous support for this evening's program. And I will now introduce Mark Taylor, the museum's manager of Planetarium and Science program, who will be moderating the panel discussion and telling us a little bit about our guests. Mark?
All right, so thanks for dropping in, everyone. So as Sarah Lynn and Allison mentioned, my name is Mark Taylor, and I run the Planetarium and the Science programs at the Hudson River Museum. Now, given that the museum is right on the Hudson River, we try to make sure that we represent sciences and scientific research which is relevant to people who live in the Hudson River watershed. And given that the Hudson is an estuary, essentially it's an arm of the ocean, a lot of what happens in and around the Hudson River directly affects the ocean nearby. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've actually been working with artists like Mr. Uribe, who have been talking in their work, really bringing forward things which have been affected, where we have affected things in the ocean, given what we're doing in our backyard, basically. So this is actually the second time that Frederica has had pieces at the museum. We're really happy that he was able to come back. Now, Frederica was born in Colombia, and currently lives in Miami. And we were talking about a week ago, and he was describing how his studio is just filled with materials, and he walks through and he just finds the materials themselves speaking to him, and figuring out things that he can create based just from that. Now, let's see. I know that he started out as a painter, and he has basically put his brushes aside and devoted himself full-time to creating art which has been described as surprises and engages. So he makes objects that are assemblages of things like bullet shells, cut up pieces of colored pencils, colored shoelaces and pins, electrical wires. One of my favorites was the handles from paintbrushes. And he creates whimsical and things which are very communicative and very approachable, I think. So we're going to be hearing from him about the piece that he has installed at the museum. We have two other guests as well. Now, I said that I'm the director of science programs at the museum. So we actually have two scientific researchers here. One of those researchers is Laurel Zaima. She is the program manager of non-degree education and outreach programs at the Columbia Climate School. And she coordinates professional learning workshops for for students who are interested in advancing their knowledge, and not just adults, but she also works with high school students as well. She works on education initiatives that communicate topics of sustainability and climate change and climate action for the general public, K through 12 students, things like that. She's also an instructor of the Terranaut Club, which is a nonprofit organization which is committed to providing science and environmental education opportunities for young women and gender minorities through immersive experiences in STEM and nature. And like I said, she's based right at the Columbia Climate School and affiliated with Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Now, Lamont-Doherty is right across the river from the museum. So if you ever visit the museum, look up the river a little bit and you can see it. However, we have another guest here as well, Rowan McLachlan. She is a research scientist who's interested in the conservation of coral reefs. And coral reefs are complex organisms, so there's a fun word that we use to describe the organisms that make up the coral reef. We call them holobionts. A holobiont is basically the combination of the algae that live inside the polyp and all the organisms and bacteria around them. All together, they create this extremely complex sort of superorganism, which has created the largest structures built by any living thing on Earth. Forget the Great Wall of China. Coral reefs are way beyond that. And one thing I would encourage you to do, actually, if you want to look her up afterwards, she has a great expedition blog where she talks about the places that she's been and the research that she's done. So she's interested in things like ocean warming, ocean acidification, nutrient pollution, and overfishing on coral physiology. And also I mentioned those bacteria that are part of that holobiont. So she's interested in the microbiome as well. So we'll be hearing from all of them talking about coral reefs, what they're like today, and what they might be like in the future, and how our actions might affect that future for coral reefs. So what I'm going to do right now, just a second. So what I'm going to do right now, which is going to get our slideshow ready to go. I think once I do that, we'll be able to start with Federico. So he can talk a little bit about the piece that he has created and which we have on display in the museum. So Federico, are you ready to go?
Sure.
Okay. So let me do this. Okay. As always, there we go. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, get that up there. And here we go. Okay, can everyone see that?
Sure.
All right. Okay, so Federico, right now we're looking at an image of your piece at the museum. And it's a little bit hard to tell from this picture just at a glance, but if you look closely, you'll notice that the objects in here are not objects which were designed to look like parts of a coral reef. What you've done is the assemblage that you do using the materials from your studio. So could you talk a little bit about what your goal was here and what your process was?
I'm always moved by the beauty of nature. I believe that nature is really the connection to mysticism. I'm not a religious person in any way, but I do have the feeling that confrontations with nature are the only possibility for you to have this mystical connection with the rest of the universe. So coral reefs is one of the most amazing, beautiful parts of life and on Earth. The most surprising forms and shapes and colors and actions and movements, and I was always impressed by this beauty. And I believe in the power of seduction of beauty. So once I started hearing news long time ago about these islands of plastic, of garbage, and plastic in the Pacific Ocean, the size of, I don't remember the side of the state or the side of the, but they were humongous. And started doing some research and watching videos of people that is researching and investigating and trying to deal with this fact. And I decided to build a coral reef out of plastic garbage. So I started collecting all the plastic that I was around me. And I came to the realization that I never had before, that the amount of plastic that we all used and consumed is much bigger than we ever expected. We say just collecting from soap containers and plastic bags and water bottles. And so I asked my 3 employees to collect all the garbage they could on plastic. I asked my friends, and it's something pretty beautiful happened. That all my friends started collecting all this plastic, brought these big big black bags of garbage from their houses. They started changing their behavior, started buying 2 that were made out of wood and recyclable, reusable. What's the name of this thing you sort water with? ¿Cómo se llama pitillo, papá? Straws. Straws. And I started building this, and it came out that all this plastic is also, it has its beauty to it because it's all colorful. Let's say it was helpful. It was painful in a weird way, and it was helpful in another way. It was helpful because the result worked. It was painful because the realization how much plastic it is and how much we contribute to this thing that we all complain that when people talk about all this garbage in the ocean, they always but as if it was happening somewhere else to other people that we didn't have anything to do with it. And we all have to do with it. We all use plastic toothbrushes. We all use, I didn't use one bags in the supermarket, but I used to use them. And everything is packaged. Everything is packaged in plastic. Whatever you buy in pharmacy is packaged on plastic. Creams, whatever. So I had the hope that people was going to be seduced by the beauty of this invention and maybe have some conscience and maybe change some behaviors, and started to be conscious of the amount of plastic we use and ask themselves, where is this plastic going to go? What is it going to happen with this? How is it reusable? So that was, in a sense, that was what I did. That was my answer. I hope it was satisfactory.
All right. Let me try to see if I can get this full. Okay, can everybody still see that?
Yes.
Okay, great, just checking. Yeah, so I thought it was interesting you said that people aren't necessarily thinking about how what they do affects things elsewhere. You know, the thing with plastic is that it's designed to last as long as possible and be as inert as possible. So you put it in the water and it can end up a very long way away. Just one quick thing, you had described your studio where you just said that it is just full of materials and you basically walk through the studio and you get your ideas just by seeing the material that you've accumulated, more or less, right?
We nowadays we live in this world which at an incredible speed things become obsolete. I remember clearly when vinyl records were changed for CD records, and we thought that that was the end of it, and it wasn't. It didn't last much. So now there are millions of CDs out there, millions of CDs, and now they do a lot of surgery that is robotic. So now there are a lot of millions of instruments. So every industry today is designed to make other objects obsolete. So my studio is full of things that are becoming obsolete for whatever reason, for one reason or another. People nowadays send me stuff. They just ask me and send me stuff that became obsolete for whatever reason. I make paintings out of neckties, because neckties used 8 centimeters wide, and now they're 7. They're perfect, beautiful Italian silk ties that have no use. So now there are all these objects that have no use that you cannot not think, and how the existence of this garbage, all this garbage, going to affect nature, which is where we live from, where we live, where we eat, is everything that our life supported by nature, and all these superfluous and objects are affecting this environment in which we live. So I have a lot of things in my studio. I started making some paintings out of X-rays, and I asked people if they had X-rays, and I got so much X-rays, you didn't believe it. Boxes and boxes and boxes of X-rays. I made some beautiful paintings out of X-rays, cutting bone by bone, but all this plastic and silver and whatever is into these subjects, it just gone, probably gone to the sea, gone to the water. Probably we eating it.
Well, why don't we do this right now? You're talking about, we're going to talk about how these things end up in the ocean, but why don't we go into a little bit more about what is actually happening in the ocean, and about the living things that all of our materials end up affecting. So I'm just going to go down to the next slide here. So what I want to do right now is just get a little background on what it is that is out in the ocean, and how coral reefs are affected by the things that we've been doing off of the shore. So at this point, I just want to turn things over real quick to Dr. Rowan McLachlan, sorry, I was pronouncing that. So she's a researcher over at Oregon State University, and she's just going to tell us a bit about coral reefs in general, and specifically how they're affected by some of the activities that humans have been doing, even on the shore, thousands of miles away.
Thanks, Mark. Can everybody hear me okay?
Sure.
Brilliant, thanks. Yes, so my name is Rowan McLachlan, and I'm a marine biologist working at Oregon State University. For my work, I investigate coral reefs, and in particular, how they're affected by stressors such as climate change and pollution and overfishing and things like that. So next slide, please. Mark? Someone click the presentation. Perfect. One more time. Click. Sorry, there are a lot of animations on this presentation.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so coral reefs are sometimes known or called the rainforests of the ocean. And this is because they're very biodiverse ecosystems. And so coral reefs cover only a small portion of the Earth's surface, less than 1%. But despite this small size, coral reefs are home to more than 30% of all marine species. So that's a substantial proportion. So they're very, very biodiverse, very important places on our planet. Now, coral reefs provide a variety of goods and services to mankind. For instance, they provide food and habitat for a variety of species, including commercially important fish species. They are also provide coastal protection from storms and hurricanes. And they also contribute to our economy through tourism and recreation activities. And it's been estimated that coral reefs contribute more than $100 trillion to the global economy every year. Next slide. So what is a coral? And Mark, if you could just sort of slowly click through these. So a coral is a colonial animal. If we look closer, you can see that the coral tissue is composed of hundreds of individual polyps. Now, each of these polyps, if we look even closer, is composed of a ring of tentacles that surround a mouth. Now, the coral uses these tentacles for self-defense, but also to collect plankton from the water. And so the coral are able to eat this plankton. Keep clicking, please. Keep going. Now, if we look closely, we can see that embedded within the coral tissue are millions of microscopic algal cells. Now, these algal cells are really important for coral. These algae are able to photosynthesize, and so they are able to use sunlight, and through the process of photosynthesis, convert this into sugar. Keep clicking. So the algae then share this sugar that they are producing with their animal coral host, and then exchange receive nutrients. And so this relationship of sharing resources between the animal and the algae is called a symbiotic relationship. And this symbiosis is the foundation of a healthy coral reef. Now, unfortunately, when the ocean seawater temperature starts to increase, this makes it a stressful environment for these algal cells. And what happens is they are expelled from the tissue of the coral. And so the algae are released. And if you click one more, keep clicking, this causes what we, a process or phenomenon known as coral bleaching. And so when a coral is bleached, it appears white in color. And this is because you can now see through the translucent tissue at that underlying skeleton. Now the coral is still alive, it just no longer has that algal partner. Yep, thank you. And so here's a photograph taken on a coral reef that I work on. This is in French Polynesia. This photograph was taken in March of 2019. Now, unfortunately, that summer, French Polynesia experienced a marine heat wave, and the ocean temperature was above average. If I click to the next photograph, this photo was taken only 6 weeks later, and you can see that now more than half of the coral colonies are bleached, so they've lost their algal partner. Now, coral are able to recover from coral bleaching. They're able to regain their algal cells if that water temperature cools down and it remains cool for an extended period of time. The coral are able to recover. However, coral bleaching is one of the major impacts of ocean warming. And so if you go to the next slide, please. And so as many of you know, the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is increasing. And this is due to the burning of fossil fuels coupled with mass deforestation. If you click again. And the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has been increasing, and over the past 40 years, it's occurred at a rate that's 100 times faster than anything we've seen in the past. And so this buildup of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere leads to global warming, which has detrimental impacts for all life, but in particular coral reefs. Next slide, please. And you can just keep clicking through this one, please, Mark. Keep going. So since the 1970s, the ocean has absorbed more than 93% of the heat from global warming. And it's also become 30% more acidic. And this is due to that carbon dioxide gas dissolving in the ocean. Now, unless we're able to mitigate and reduce carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, it's estimated that by the end of this century, the oceans will become 1 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer and up to 0.2 pH units more acidic. And so this will have devastating consequences for marine life and in particular coral reefs. Next slide, please. And so I already discussed ocean warming, but unfortunately that's not the only threat to coral reefs. And the other major impact of climate change is what we call ocean acidification. So if you just click a few times here, please, Mark. So this carbon dioxide gas dissolves into the ocean. And when it does that, it changes the chemistry of the water. So what happens is the pH of that seawater decreases and the concentration of carbonate ions also decreases. Click one more time. Now this is important because the coral skeleton is composed of a mineral called calcium carbonate. And so as that pH decreases and the carbonate ion decreases, this causes the coral skeleton to become weak and brittle and also reduces the growth rate of coral. Next slide. And so I've discussed ocean warming and ocean acidification, but unfortunately, these are only some of the things that coral reefs are threatened by. And the other one, which is obviously the topic of today's conversation, is plastic pollution. If you click through, please, Mark. So it's been estimated that 9 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. 9 million tons, that's such a large number. How can we think about that? Well, I did the math, and that's the equivalent to 30,000 statues of liberty entering the ocean every year. That's just a phenomenal amount. It's been estimated that mid-century, there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And it's also been estimated that this plastic in the ocean is killing more than 1 million seabirds every year and 100,000 marine mammals. And so for corals, not only, as you can see, this plastic bag is covering the coral colony, this is preventing the coral from photosynthesizing, right? It's blocking light, but also it's causing abrasions to the coral tissue, which makes them more susceptible to pathogens and disease. And so this has all been a quick summary of some of the threats that coral reefs face. And I realize it can sound a little bit doom and gloom, but in my research, I'm interested in discovering where's the hope, right? Which individuals, which species, which reefs, which regions of the globe have resilient corals, corals that are going to be able to survive climate change and pollution and persist into the future. And so I tried to take a positive outlook on my work and really find where is the hope for coral reefs. And that's the end of my presentation.
Beautiful.
Yeah, just a very quick summary of some of the issues that coral reefs are facing and the basic mechanics of coral reefs as well. Now we will get back to this and we will get back to Rowan, but right now wanted to move on to our other guest, make sure that we get mentioned in here. Going to speak with Laurel Zaima Sheehy. How do you say that?
Sheehy.
I thought so. Sheehy. Okay. So she's based at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, which is part of Columbia University, right across the river pretty much, and that's River Museum. And she's going to talk about the work that she's been doing, raising awareness with the public, essentially, of some of the challenges that rivers and oceans face. So can go ahead, Laura.
Thanks, Mark. And it's just such an honor to be here on this panel with everyone. I just wanted to give a quick background about myself. So in addition to, my professional pieces of my bio that I'm an environmental educator and science communicator, and my educational background that I have, I'm a marine biologist and a sustainability scientist. I also want to share a little bit about myself personally. We're all friends here, and I think learning about our interests and passions really helps to understand what drives us. So as a young kid, I've always been just enamored with the outdoors. If you couldn't find me, I was out in nature somewhere. probably exploring, growing up in Michigan, exploring the Great Lakes. So it was through just a really memorable experience around when I was 9, just snorkeling for the first time in the ocean, that I knew I wanted to be a marine scientist. So that was what I was going to pursue. You could not talk me out of it. So I did. I went to University of Miami. So Federico, I love Miami. It's near and dear to my heart. And I studied marine science. And the more I learned about the ocean, the more I learned about the threats, many of which Rowan had just discussed, among many others. And so what I had been learning in the classroom kind of mirrored what I was experiencing during my field work, going to the beaches, the coastlines, scuba diving underwater, that the threats that are facing our ocean are destroying habitats, they're threatening animals. But it's not like there wasn't hope. We could make a difference, but it really starts with education as that critical foundation. So it's kind of how the quote goes, that you only conserve what you love, you only love what you understand, and we only understand what we're taught. So knowing that, having myself some transformative experiences in education and place-based experiential learning, I knew that was what I wanted to pursue. I wanted to provide these experiences for the next generation so they can also be change makers. You can go to the next slide. And so at the Hudson River Field Station, which is run by Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, we do just that. We provide science, historical, and cultural exploration of place. So we find that the Hudson River itself is really the best classroom for instruction and scientific exploration, particularly of complex system science. So we host students, teachers, and the general public down at the end of Piermont Pier in Rockland County. If you're local, I encourage you to come visit us at the field station, and we'll do some explorations of the Hudson. So some things that we work on, we do direct scientific exploration of biology, chemistry, and the physical characteristics of the estuary. We also kind of explore these different artifacts that provide this historical context of the area and our human cultural connection to the Hudson. One example is, we find remnants of these bricks just kind of scattered along our shoreline. And that's really because we had a booming brick industry right here in Rockland, around the Haverstraw area, due to just the plethora of clay deposits in the area. So it really kind of tells about our human and cultural ties to the area. And then our landscape just has this beautiful educational backdrop, so we can talk about the geologic history of the area. So the Palisades Sill, and you can see, if you look at a topographic map, the glacial striations in the landscape, all of these are really forming what the Hudson Valley is today in this really unique and beautiful environment. You can go to the next slide. So at the Hudson River Field Station, our mission is to provide place-based learning opportunities of the Hudson through field investigations, allowing participants to explore themselves and learn from the natural world. So anything, I understand the importance of classroom teaching, but I think pairing that with field explorations really is impactful for young people in particular, but learners of all ages, of course, as well. You can go to the next slide. So with this mission, we have developed a summer program called the Next Generation of Hudson River Educators. So this program focuses on developing students' connection to the Hudson, and we place a special emphasis on the engagement of students that are historically underrepresented in the sciences. So throughout the course of this program, students of Rockland County, they increase their understanding and science literacy of the Hudson through these field experiences that I mentioned. So in this picture, you can see the students are going seining to do a biodiversity survey of the area off of Piermont Pier. In the actual field station laboratory, they're doing some water chemistry tests to see what the water conditions are like, and how that relates to the biology that we're catching. And oftentimes this is the students' first time that they're even seeing life in the Hudson or holding a fish for the first time. So it's a pretty exciting experience as well. So once the students, they have this foundational understanding of the Hudson and its complex systems, then we empower them to create their own educational materials that are field-based, inclusive, culturally relevant, and targeting a multi-generational audience with the goal of trying to broaden our estuary education throughout the Hudson Valley. So, you know, these students, they know their community is best. They know what residents in their community, what would be that tie to them and nature, or that tie to them in the Hudson. So by empowering them to create these educational materials and then to deliver these materials to their family and friends and community members, then they are also building their own public speaking skills, and we can work together to broaden the outreach of estuary education and just really emphasizing the importance of the Hudson. We can go to the next slide. So in 2021, our program, we had a lot of students that, you know, it was amazing being able to be immersed in Hudson science, but they were really disheartened by the amount of pollution that they saw along the pier. And it's inevitable. We have, you know, the Hudson is known as the river that flows both ways. As an estuary, this tidal system is bringing and moving this debris throughout the Hudson, and with the pier being 1 mile in length, stretching out into about halfway into the Hudson, it catches a lot of this debris that's been moving back and forth. So it gets lined up along our shoreline, and it causes a lot of harm to the biodiversity that lives here. So in 2021, we had students that created infographic posters to encourage people in the Piermont area to ensure that they're recycling properly, disposing of their waste properly, particularly any fishing gear, because that can pose a real threat to the environment. And they presented at one of the board meetings, and it was approved by the mayor. So if you ever drive down Piermont, you'll see some really nice posters that were created by the students of this program. And now this past summer in 2022, the students wanted to take it one step further. They wanted to understand, so this plastic that we see, this macroplastic, it doesn't always stay in that form once it enters the environment. Plastic doesn't biodegrade, but it breaks up into tiny pieces of microplastics. Some microplastics are smaller than the eye can see. So the students wanted to know, given how much macroplastic we see, does that correlate with the microplastic in the water body off of Piermont Pier? So with a collaboration with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Hudson River Estuary Program and the Rosalia Project that's led by Rachel Miller, Lamont's field station, we were able to create this method to extract microplastics from a water body and analyze it using pretty inexpensive materials in a very accessible methodology. So the students are out here, they're doing their sampling. You can see some of the materials are a mason jar, a metal bucket, a graduated cylinder, some things that aren't too expensive. You'll also notice that they're wearing these ridiculous orange sweaters. That is because we are the least common color of microfiber pollution. So if they're wearing these orange, hoodies, and we see an orange fiber in our sample, then we can assume that that is a contamination from ourselves as opposed to an actual fiber from the water body. So the students were able to process the water. On the bottom left, you can see there's a slide with some circles. The students first looked under a normal stereo microscope and were able to identify anything that looks like a fiber or microplastic, and they circled it with a little Sharpie. Then using a fluorescent light and a scope, they were able to fluoresce any microplastics. So that's the picture on the right. So one of the students, they even just put their hand under the light and they were astonished by how many microplastics are glowing on their hand just from living. I mean, there are microplastics that are in the air, the water, in our soil. We can, if we're wearing Anything synthetic, we're shedding microplastics as well. You can kind of think of that as like Pigpen from Charlie Brown, who's just kind of creating dust around him. We have like a little dust cloud of plastics around us as well. So the students were, I mean, I think this was a really a memorable moment for them to realize that microplastics are a huge problem. The plastic pollution is a real problem, not just for our oceans, our water bodies, but as well for us as humans. So they wanted to take it a step further and to drive actionable change in their communities. So together we kind of thought through some things that we can, some calls to action that we can all do to reduce the plastic pollution problem and to address it. So you can go to the next slide. So the first thing is that as a global community, we need to stop excessively producing plastic, endorsing plastic production companies, and releasing it into the environment. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with the process of plastic production, but plastic is made from petrochemicals. So it is driven by the fossil fuel industry. So not only is the fossil fuel industry responsible for, well, you know, they're producing all of this oil that we use in our daily lives that is creating climate change, it's driving global warming, but with our transition to renewable energy, the fossil fuel industry is also going to pivot to ensure that they can stay profitable, and they're going to pivot into pushing more into the plastic production space. So we need to make sure that you know, our personal decisions are really important. Our daily decisions are important, but we also need to hold these fossil fuel companies responsible. Oftentimes, as consumers, we don't choose whether our groceries are packaged in plastic or if we can kind of pull them right off of the shelf. So we need to encourage companies to reduce their reliance on plastics that we don't need, and we need to hold these fossil fuel industries accountable. We also need to stop providing them with, you know, government subsidies and huge bailouts, and we need to start to use that funding to transition away from fossil fuels as a whole, but also the production of particularly single-use plastics. Okay, we can go to the next slide. The next step is to remove the plastic from the environment and remove it from just this linear waste stream. So this could look like something that you could do in your community tomorrow. You could do a community cleanup. It would educate your neighbors and your friends about the plastic challenge, as well as doing good for your own neighborhood. It's extremely powerful. As well as there's a lot of technologies that are coming out that are generated from youth. It is so inspiring. A couple examples, at 18 years old, Boy in Slack created this incredible genius idea of the ocean cleanup. It kind of mimics the way that a manta ray moves, but it's able to catch and filter out all the plastic that are concentrated in these gyres, the same gyres that Federico had been talking about earlier, where these they're like giant plastic islands essentially in the 5 gyres around the ocean. So he was able to, he's been testing it and deploying this technology, but it's hopefully able to address this cleanup problem that's out in the ocean. And there was another teenager that had created, using magnets, a way to pick up microplastics from a water body. Now, it wouldn't work out in the ocean, but maybe, who knows, like in a wastewater treatment plant, extracting those microplastics before we release that effluent back into our waterways would be hugely impactful. So I'm really inspired by all this new technology that's coming out, particularly from young people. And finally, we need to educate our friends and family. So if you are listening today and you are taking some pieces of information from each of the speakers, I encourage you to share that more broadly. A lot of our efforts start with a grassroots effort, from a bottom-up approach to make big change. So tell your friends and family about what you learned today, and also make a pledge to stop using as much single-use plastic if you can. There's a study that found that we use single-use plastics on average for only 12 minutes. 12 minutes we use a plastic that then lives on forever. So we can stop using, plastic bags at the grocery store, or straws or cutlery when you get takeout food. I mean, there's a million ideas out there that we can all do. So I encourage you all to do that. Make a pledge today.
Turn my thing back on. There we go. Okay, so thank you. So a great summary of both Federico's work and also the biology of corals, and also some of the efforts that are being taken to try to educate people more directly about the effect that they've had on the natural world. Now, I'm sure some of you have questions. I'm actually going to stop the screen share right here. Go. Let's stop that. Okay. We can bring that back up if we need to, but I wanted to make sure that I could see the chat questions and so forth, and also Sarah Linda and Allison, if there's any questions you see people posting and I'm missing, just let me know. I did have a bunch of things which occurred to me to ask. So I wanted to actually turn to Rowan, to Dr. McLachlan. And one of the things which Laurel mentioned was when you have plastic in the ocean, the pieces that Frederica has made his art from are plastics more or less as we would use them. Almost an intact bottle, an intact cap, an intact fork. Maybe things are in smaller pieces, but in generally they're pretty much in the form that we would use them. But what happens over time is that they tend to get broken down into smaller pieces. That happens with ultraviolet light from the sun, the action of waves. Also, a lot of times things are discarded at the beach, so it's the motion of the sand. But one thing I was wondering about is obviously a bag that's wrapped around coral, as it's moving with the waves, is going to braid the coral. But smaller pieces, it seems like they would also have an abrasion effect inside the coral polyp itself. And just a little quick diagram, when we talk about a coral polyp, basically it's sort of just a sort of stomach with these tentacles sticking out. So things go into the coral, it can digest them, and then things are expelled pretty much in the same direction. So it's basically just a sort of sac. So if stuff is inside the coral, I was wondering if you found anything, or if you know of any work that's been done about the effect of microplastics as sort of physically affecting the interior of a coral or the body of coral.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question, Mark. And there have been a lot of upcoming studies now looking at the effects of microplastics on coral reefs, and there is some evidence that corals are ingesting those micro particles, mistaking them for plankton and eating them. And so not only can that lead to decrease in coral health and mortality by the corals almost choking on these particles, but a lot of these microplastics are also releasing harmful toxins. And so those toxins, again, impact the coral health, and not only the coral, right? When we talk about coral reefs, yes, the coral animal is the ecosystem engineer. It constructs the habitat, it builds the city, if you will, but the coral reef is composed of thousands of different species. We're including fish and crustaceans and turtles and dolphins and all of the various organisms that live around the reef and rely on the reef. And so each one of those organisms is also affected by macro and microplastic. And so I think one of the more famous videos that has made it onto the internet is of the sea turtle getting the plastic straw removed from its nostril. It got stuck up there. And then we also see images of seabirds with, the discarded nets from fishing vessels and things like that. The plastic that's used to connect cans of soda or beer, those plastic rings, those get trapped around the necks of of lots of birds and marine mammals. And so there's just almost every living thing in the ocean is affected by plastic. And so it has this trickle down and almost a trickle up effect, right?
And actually, Laurel, when you were talking about the fact that plastics are made from sort of fossil fuel sources, one of the big sources of plastic these days is actually natural gas. So we'll take natural gas, we process the gas into basically little plastic beads, and these beads are then brought somewhere where they're made into various products. And I know that one of the horrifying things that happens every now and then is that shipments of these beads will essentially fall off of a ship, and they'll end up completely clogging seacoasts, and they are the perfect size to look like fish eggs. So things will try to pick them up and eat them. And tiny bit of chemistry, you two can correct me if I get this wrong, but what I think happens is plastic, because it has a tendency to sort of have a similar chemistry to a lot of oily substances, essentially what they can do is they can act almost like a sort of drug delivery system, where things can get absorbed by the plastic, and then once it gets ingested, as if we were trying to give some medicine to the fish, all those oils and substances that are in the plastic will then get released into the body of that animal. So even if it's able to ingest the plastic and it can't digest it and somehow it can still, get rid of it and poop it out, it may have already absorbed something from the plastic. I don't know if that's something that you've talked about with the students that you've worked with, Laurel.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So plastics can be made with toxic chemicals like plasticizers or flame retardants. Those can leach into whatever host has ingested it. They also, just as you said, Mark, act as a sponge. While they're out in the environment, they are just absorbing everything they come into contact with. So something that, people living in the Hudson Valley are very familiar with is that we have a challenge with PCBs. Plastics love PCBs. They will absorb them, and then when something eats them, they will leach that into the fish or the animal that's ingested it. And ultimately, that could be us if we are eating a fish that has ingested plastic that also has toxins in its body. Now we're eating that, and it's going into our bodies as well. There are also some studies looking at, it's pretty emerging, but the impact of nanoplastics. These plastics are even smaller than microplastics, and they might be able, oh yes, thanks, Mark. These nanoplastics might be able to, cross through barriers in our body. They're flowing with our blood and being transported to different areas. And if these, tiny, tiny plastics have any of these chemicals in them, and let's say they're now in our brains or in our organs, and they're releasing them directly into this, like a key part of our body, what impact does it have on our health? Like, there's a lot of studies being done right now to try and answer those questions.
Okay. Okay, I see there is one question I wanted to get to in the chat, but I also did have a question for Federico real quick. So Frederica, I know that you have talked about how people have brought you materials. And I was wondering if when they bring you the materials and they see what you create with them, if they then come back to you and say, I hadn't realized how big a problem this is, or if the act of them collecting things sort of opens them up to understanding more than they had before.
Absolutely. At least all my employees have realized the impact of this, and some of them got into the idea of knowing better and watching YouTube of these documentaries of this problem, and a lot of them did change their behavior in ways, simple ways. Not using plastic bags from the supermarket, not trying not to buy things that are unnecessarily packed, that you could buy unpacked. So they do change. Absolutely. I don't know about people that see the exhibition, but people that help me to collect all this garbage definitely had an impact on their life. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, so let me just get this question. So Howard just wanted to know if you three could elaborate on where you find hopefulness in all of these problems, because he's very inspired by your enthusiasm and what you're willing to go through to learn more and to teach others and to to create. But we just wanted to know where you find hope with all of the problems and issues that we seem to be facing.
I think that people like us that is worried about these facts, doing whatever it can do, we may be defending our own dignity only. I don't really, people have not much faith that it really reversed, but I act as if I did have that faith, because I need that faith. I need that faith to keep working, and I need that faith for people keep working and living and trying to believe that life is worth it and nature is worth it to protect. But I don't, listening to scientists that have been invited to this panel, as hard as is really painful and hard to see hope on on this process, on the intoxication of the water or the world warming or damages that we humans are doing. So I believe that we all here in this panel, and everybody that is connected to this today, we just hopeful and had this wishful thinking that we may be able to help somehow, and we creating education and faith on other people. But I don't really know where to get that faith from.
Yes, I can go next. Where do I find hope? Well, I find hope in both nature and also in humanity. So in nature, in the coral reefs that I study, we find examples of certain coral species that are more resilient to climate change. For example, in a study that we did last year, we found that corals that belong to the group known as Porites, the genus Porites, in Hawaii are more resilient to ocean warming and ocean acidification than some other species. And so in those individuals, we find glimmers of hope that they might persist in future. And we also find there are certain regions of coral reefs around the world that are more resilient. In Hawaii, in the Red Sea, and even in Colombia, there's a reef there that basically is living in an area that's heavily polluted with sediment in the water. It looks, like a brown soup. There's so much dredging happening in that area that you wouldn't expect to find anything living. And yet there's a coral reef there that's just thriving under the surface, hidden. And so that's another example where, corals and coral reefs might be more resilient and hardy than we give them credit for. And the second part of my hope is in humanity, right? When we think about the crisis of the hole in the ozone, right? The hole in the ozone layer, and how that it reached the news, it reached the media, and then that inspired people to change, and we were able to reduce the growing and the expansion of the hole in the ozone layer through changes in human behavior, through changes in policy. And so I like to think that as we educate the public and we make better political decisions and things like that, that eventually we will be able to combat climate change and change our behavior before it's too late. And if we're able to make changes towards mitigating the effects of climate change, then, coral reefs and the ocean and biology worldwide will have a chance.
I love that. And couldn't agree more. I think it's really easy to be so overwhelmed with the challenges that we're facing. And the media has a tendency to really focus on the negative. And actually, there's a study that came out that showed that our brains also focus on the bad. But it takes a little more effort. But there are incredible breakthroughs that are happening right now worldwide. And so it takes a little digging. You got to do some research, a little reading, podcasts. I find a lot of things on podcasts that are really inspiring. But there's a lot of movement towards transitioning away from fossil fuels. We're addressing climate both through mitigation and adaptation. Plastic wise, there was a ban that was enacted in California for single-use plastics. They're doing it in phases, but that is a huge win. The UK banned single-use plastic as well. So there are lots of wins out there. We don't, as our brains, we don't always focus on them, but I think we should. There's also, if there's anyone that's on Instagram out there, there's Instagrams that focus on positive climate news, and that is their whole platform. And it's really inspiring and great. And I think that is what motivates me, as well as the youth. The young people are incredible. They are so motivated, so activated. They're ready to make a change right now. A lot of times people say, oh, you can wait till you're 18 and vote, and that is how you make a difference. But they're like, nope, I'm not 18 yet, and I'm going to make a difference right now. And they're going out there, they're protesting, they are making changes in their school, in their communities. It's really inspiring. So I think the young people, that's where I get my hope from.
One thing that I will mention there is that it can be easy to think that you're the only one who feels a certain way, but I would guess that the people who are here today are probably of the same mind as you in terms of concern. And there are plenty of people who feel the same way who are not here tonight. There have been people who have studied essentially what people think others think are important issues. And if you talk about things like pollution, for example, people will rank that very high in terms of their concern, and they will think that everybody else ranks it lower. But it turns out that if you actually talk to people, their concerns are more forefront than you might think. So a lot of times, the reporting can be about the disasters, or someone who is in a position of power and influence. They got to that position of power and influence because of the way things are. So there's a tendency to try to kind of keep things the way that they are. So a lot of times, if you are in that position, you might not want to entertain the idea that people want things to change, because you're not, that's not how you sort of got to your position, right? So if enough people go and say, hey, we're actually all for this, then sometimes change can happen very, very quickly. I wrote a long answer there about octopi and squid. Basically, yeah, coral animals do look a little bit like a little octopus, but they're very different. So I just tried to explain that real quick. If there's any other questions or anything anyone might have. No, we're run over time. That usually happens. That's a good thing. To run a little bit over means that we're interested in what we're doing and we're getting a lot out of it. But let's see. So if anybody else has any other questions or comments or whatever, you can put those in the chat. Is there anything, Saralina, that maybe you wanted to mention about the artwork itself that we have in the museum, some of the reactions that you've seen to it?
Well, first of all, I did have a question for Rowan, which is, where is the coral reef in your background? It is so exquisite. And can one snorkel there?
This is looking at the coral species that are there, it is from the internet, but I would guess this is from the Great Barrier Reef.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Oh, and thank you. And actually, there is a question here from Nicole. Where can she get resources to share with elementary students? Now, Mark, I know that we provided some information on our website, but we have two experts here. Apart from bringing your students to the museum to see Federico's incredible installation, which will be up through February 12th, and is something that is been inspiring young and old since it's been up. I mean, the youngest kids, you think, oh, well, they won't realize. They get it. They get it. They're excited. They get drawn in by its beauty, and they get the message. But I'm wondering, between Laurel and Rowan, if you have any suggestions for Nicole.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for some, information more about the impacts of climate change on the ocean in general and about coral reefs, I think the NOAA website, so that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association website, has a lot of distilled information and a lot of resources. That would be one place to check out.
Thanks. Anything else, Laurel?
Yeah, Nicole, if you're interested in some lessons or activities that you can use in your classroom that are, I don't know if you're in the Hudson Valley area, but the Lamont Hudson River Field Station webpage has an area that has K through 5 lessons and activities, and then another area for 6 through 12. So you can select based on your grade level. They also host school group visits if you wanted to have that place-based experiential scientific learning with your students. And then we actually held a couple of events, an educator training this fall, as well as a event for a movie screening all about plastics. So I'm going to share that link in the chat as well. Everything was recorded, and I also created a 7-part curriculum on plastics, more toward elementary school or early middle school students. That will be up on our website, on the Columbia Climate School website very soon, all open for anyone to download and use.